Thank you, Ellie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us late on a Friday at the end of what I'm sure has been a very busy week for you all. As I mentioned, my name is Mark Howlett and I am Head of Assessment in our General Qualifications team. So we are here today to talk about determining grades for students and how you will arrive at your grades for your students this year. It's worth mentioning at this point that we are also holding subject-specific meetings similar to these, where we'll be able to go into a bit more detail and focus on any specific subject-related questions that you have. As Ali mentioned, we will have a Q&A session and we'll do our very best to get through as many of those as possible. As I'm sure you can appreciate, with a large volume of attendees today, we may not be able to cover all of those specific questions, but we'll certainly do our best and try and get through as many of the key themes that are coming through that question and answer session as possible. So just as a sort of general overview, what is it we're going to look at today? So we're going to start with just a reminder of the overview of arrangements for the 2021 assessment window this year, look at some of the key dates and some of the key bits of information just as a reminder for how grades are going to be arrived at this year. We're then going to spend a bit more time looking at some of the key considerations around determining grades for your students and also some of the key information and documentation that has been made available to help support you during this period. And then, as mentioned, towards the end of this session, hopefully about 20-25 minutes, we'll have for us to answer any questions that you wish to submit through the Q&A box, as Eddie mentioned. So again, just as a reminder and just to refresh everyone's memory of the arrangements for this year, as was confirmed, students will receive grades this year awarded and determined by teachers. And a really key principle this year is to ensure that the grades students received are based on content that the students have been taught, not on what they haven't been able to cover due to any reason related to lockdown, the pandemic in general, and of course the lost teaching and learning that is associated with that. As a reminder and as a sort of departure from the initial approach to last summer, no algorithm will be used in determining grades this year, so we will not be applying an algorithm to the grades that you award this year. Again, as been stressed many times before, teachers will be determining grades and they'll be able to pull on and use a range of evidence when determining grades for their students this year. And that includes the optional use of the additional assessment materials that were produced by examination boards, any mock papers or mock exams that your students have sat using past materials or materials that you have devised and set yourselves. Any coursework or non-examined assessments that students have either completed or partially completed, as well as, of course, any other type of work that has been set throughout the course, either in class or by the teachers, and that could include essays or any kind of in-class tests that students may have completed. We have provided, along with a lot of the JCQ guidance, our own support and guidance for teachers, and all of that information can be provided on, found on our website. A really key date, we'll go into a bit more detail around some of the timelines and key dates in a moment, but the really key date at the moment is the 18th of June, and that's when we will be asking all teachers and centres to have submitted their grades to the awarding organisations for this year. And different to previous years and to a normal examination series, if you like, the results days this year for both GCSE, A-level and some of the vocational qualifications that awarding organisations provide will be released in the same week this year and slightly earlier than usual. So the 10th of August is when we'll be releasing our level 3 GCE qualifications and the results from those, and the 12th of August is when our GCSE results will be published. So just a few key dates there to remember. As I say, in terms of the timeline, there's lots of activity and lots of key dates that are coming up over the course of the next few weeks and months. The first one to bear in mind is that the 26th of April is the deadline for when private candidate entries need to be submitted to the awarding organisations. So if you have private candidates or your school is accepting them, that's a key date for you to take note of. The 30th of April is the deadline for all centres to submit their quality assurance policy submission, including their summary policy and the full centre policy for this year. That needs to be submitted through the centre administration portal run by the JCQ, and you can access that via Edexcel online. Really important to note at this point, we always want to stress this, that you only have to submit one policy per centre, and you can do that through any of the awarding organisations' access into the portal. In terms of the focus of today, we're obviously going to look at teacher-assessed grades and how you come to grading your students, and the submission window for that will start on the 26th of May. And as I say, the key deadline there is that all grades need to be submitted to us by the 18th of June. And as mentioned, results days there, 10th of August for AS and A-level, and any relevant level 3 results on the 10th of August, and 12th of August for level 2 results and GCSEs. And you can find all of the details about the timelines on our website, including all of those key dates as well. If you want to, and if you want to look at all the support that we have available for you, we've included the link here below, which will take you to all of the 2021 support that we put in place, both at kind of qualification level, some of the higher level information about centre policies, and all the things that you need to do as a centre across your qualifications this year, as well as detailed support for your individual subjects as well. Just to start with, we just wanted to remind you of the kind of key documentation that's available this year to support you in determining grades for your students. And the first port of call for all centres this year is the JCQ guidance on determining grades. And that was released on the 26th of March. And you can access that by going to the JCQ website. I think it's under 2021 arrangements. And that sets out all of the processes that will be in place, all the mechanisms that we will use as awarding organisations to deliver results to you, as well as all of the obligations and requirements that centres are required to follow this year in issuing fair, accurate and consistent results to their students. For those of you who are offering international qualifications or indeed based internationally, we also provided Pearson our guidance on determining grades for international qualifications, and that was released on the 1st of April. You can find that again on our website, and it has all of the detail about how grades will be determined for international qualifications this year. As I mentioned, the JCQ guidance is the main guide on how grades will be awarded to students this year. It sets out all those processes and all of the key dates, as well as some guidance and support around the various sort of processes that you need to undertake, including how to gather evidence, how to ensure your students' evidence supports the grades that you're awarding to them, as well as some of the key internal and external quality assurance processes that we will be enacting this year. If you haven't done already, on the JCQ website, you can also access our editable centre policy. So we've tried to include as much information in the centre policy as possible for you in the template to help centres use that as the basis for their policies this year. So please do download that. It also contains the assessment record sheet, so how you will record the evidence that you're using for students in arriving at grades for them this year. It includes a head of department checklist to help you understand what evidence you're using, make sure that you're following all the processes that you need to follow, and as a reminder for any heads of department on the call about your responsibilities this year in ensuring grades for your students. It also includes grade descriptors. Across all of the awarding organisations, we have published grade descriptors for each subject across GCSE, AS and A-level, and you'll find also on the Pearson website, we recently published our grading exemplification, which draws upon evidence from past assessments that students have sat and links to those grade descriptors to help support you in making judgments this year. And just finally, we've shared on our website the top 10 most important things to take note of. You can find that interactive PDF on our website, and it just tries to draw out all the key elements of support that's available, all the key elements in terms of processes and guidance that has been issued, and to draw your attention to those key elements at this time. And as I say, you can find all of that information from the Joint Council website at the website link on the page at the moment. So under Summer 2021 arrangements on the JCQ website, you'll find all of those documentations. And finally, you can find all of our support, as mentioned, on our website at the link that's included, as well as all of the support for subjects, individual subjects, as well as the overarching support that we're putting in place for you this year. So in terms of support from Pearson, we're obviously really keen to make sure that we stay in touch with all of our schools, all of our teachers as much as possible. We know this is a challenging time, and we want to provide as much support as we can to help you through the coming weeks and months. We're really committed to keeping you up to date with everything. As soon as we have the information, we want to let you know as soon as possible. So as mentioned, please do make sure you visit our dedicated Summer 2021 support page. There you'll find all the general information about the approaches that have been taken this summer, as well as be able to access some of the key subject pages with specific support available for your subjects. You can also visit the Pearson Professional Development Academy, and there we have additional support for you, including videos to help you with some of those key processes that you will have to undertake this year. So in terms of grading, what guidance has been provided so far? And we just want to give you a sort of snapshot of some of the key elements in terms of grading this year. So the first thing to note, and this is true for all students across all qualifications this year, is that the head of centre must ensure that all students have had the opportunity to show the full breadth of their knowledge and understanding in each subject that they have been taught. And the key principle this year is that the grades you are awarding is based upon the content that they have been able to cover, not on any element that they have not been able to cover due to the pandemic and all of the issues that followed as a result of that. Again, it's really important that the grades you award this year reflect a holistic, objective judgment based on the evidence of each student's performance in each subject. So what we're asking centres and teachers to do is to reflect, the grades must reflect the evidence that you have for the individual student. So rather than thinking about what grades the student might have achieved or the grades that a student could have achieved in a normal year, it's really important that you root those grades based on the evidence that you have to support that grade. Again, we are advising that as far as possible, evidence should be used consistently across the class or cohort as far as possible. We absolutely understand that for individual students within a class or within a cohort, there will be exceptions. Students may, for instance, not have been able to attend a particular assessment. They may have been unwell on the day that you set a particular task. It may be that they weren't able to collate evidence in the same way as some of their peers. But as far as possible, to ensure the consistent approach that you are taking and to make that process as fair as possible, we do advise that you use the same evidence consistently across your class. Again, it's really important to say that there's no one type of evidence that you need to use. You can draw across a range of different types of evidence, and importantly, that evidence can come from across the course of study. So we're not limiting grading decisions to be based purely on evidence that's been produced since schools returned towards the end of March, and you can use evidence from across the course of study. Of course, it's really important you think about how prepared students were at the point at which they were assessed, and how much they may have potentially improved as their learning progressed throughout their course. And then just to finally reiterate, it's really important, if you haven't done so already, that you visit our website and look at the specific subject support that we have provided for each subject this year, and visit our Pearson Professional Development Academy for all of the training resources that we have placed on there to support you this year. And again, just to highlight a couple of key sort of websites for you, so you can find again all of the support available for 2021 on the link below. And to access the Pearson Development Academy is the link for you to use. And I think, as Ellie mentioned, you will be able to download the slides from today's event and click through to those websites. So in terms of grading this summer, it's important to illustrate that there is sort of no one process that centres must follow. But what we've tried to do through the Joint Council for Qualifications guidance is set out a suggested approach that we think will help support centres come to grading decisions fairly and consistently this year. So we've outlined a 5-step process for determining grades for you. And we have, again, on the Pearson Development Academy, a PDF which sets out each of these stages for you. So again, please do visit that site and download the PDF there after this meeting. So in terms of the steps and what we believe is a reasonable process to follow in determining grades, the first step is to consider what has been taught. And I mentioned before, the key principle this summer is to ensure that grades are based on what students have been taught, not on what they haven't been taught. So the first question or consideration is what content has been taught for students? And importantly, what content have you not been able to cover because of the result of the impact of the pandemic over the last sort of 12 to 18 months? Equally, how has the content been taught? Has it been covered deeply or potentially superficially? And again, it's really important to think that just because you've covered something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've given sufficient time for students to take on board and fully understand that particular content or indeed that particular skill. So it's important to reflect on that and think about the depth in which you've been able to teach that content to your students. And it's really important when it comes to the evidence you're using to support the grades for your students that you include only those pieces of evidence that support the content that has been taught. So if a student hasn't covered a particular content area or hasn't covered a particular skill, we would not expect you to include that evidence within the evidence you're using to support the grade for the student this year. So step 2 then requires all centres to collect their evidence. So every student this year will have to have evidence that supports the grades that you are awarding. Now, as I said before, there are multiple types of evidence that you can use to support grading your students this year. There is no hierarchy to this evidence. There's no one piece that takes precedent over another. And that's to reflect the fact that, of course, students are in very different situations and very different circumstances over the course of the pandemic. So again, just to highlight some of the things and some of the evidence that we have suggested that teachers may wish to consider when grading their students. So any work produced in response to assessment materials, and that can include the additional assessment materials provided by all of the awarding organisations, but it may include things like past papers or any mock exams that students have sat using our past paper materials. As mentioned, any non-examined assessment that students may have completed, and this could include partially completed non-examined assessment as well. Any kind of student work produced in centre-devised tasks that reflect the specification. So it's really important that, yes, absolutely, you can use assessments or tasks that you have produced yourselves and sat within the centre, sort of in class. However, it's really important that that work reflects the specification. So do just double check, make sure that the content it's assessing is relevant to your specification, but also that the skills you're assessing are being assessed to the kind of skills that we would normally assess in our qualifications. For certain subjects, of course, we know it's been very challenging to assess students in practical subjects, including music, drama, and physical education. And for those types of subjects, we will, of course, accept records of students' capability and performance. We accept that it will have been difficult to record students or to watch students perform in these types of subjects over the course of the last 12 months. So any kind of records that you have about their performance and their abilities will be accepted in those instances. and of course any records you have of students' work over the course of study. And this is particularly important for work that may have been completed before the arrangements for 2021 were announced. And it's really important to stress at this point that there is no minimum requirement of content that students must have been taught. As I mentioned before, we absolutely understand that the pandemic has impacted students differently. Some students have been more or less impacted either by lockdowns, lack of access to teaching and learning, or potentially being able to come into school to take assessments. But what's really important is that when the head of centre submits your grades and submits the centre policy, that they confirm that students have been taught sufficient content to form the basis of the grade. And that's a key principle for this year, to make sure that the grades you are awarding are supported by the evidence that you have for those individual students. So step 3, in terms of the kind of retention of evidence, it's really important as far as possible you keep copies of the student's work where available and any marks that you've awarded to that, and you keep those safely within the centre. Firstly, this helps support the centre's determination of students' grades, so it helps you have a record of all of the performances from your students across the evidence that you're using, and keep them in one place. It will also help to aid the internal and external quality assurance processes. So again, it is a requirement that centres have records of all of the evidence that you've used, or the marks that you've awarded to students, or grades for a particular piece of work. And that will be useful when it comes to things like internal standardisation and making sure that you're making decisions consistently across your cohorts and across departments. But it also will be important when it comes to the external quality assurance process, and any information that the awarding bodies may need in order to confirm that the evidence you've used, the approach you've taken, has led to fair outcomes for your students. And crucially, really important in terms of the appeals process. So there's lots of detailed guidance setting out how the appeals process will work, again in the JCQ guidance that I've mentioned previously, and that the retention of evidence is really important to help support centres through that appeals process, but importantly to help students understand what evidence has been used to derive their grades, and inform any appeal that they may wish to take. And just finally to mention that any kind of scanned copies of handwritten evidence or any kind of digital documentation will be accepted and is acceptable in terms of the retention of evidence this year. So step 3 is the purpose of this is to evaluate the quality of the evidence that you have. So we've talked a lot about content coverage. It's really important to think about what kind of assessment objectives have you covered? Have you been able to gather evidence that covers all of the assessment objectives within the qualification? And if not, are there other assessments that you could potentially set your students, or work that you could ask them to do between now and the submission of grades to fill in those gaps? Again, in terms of coverage of content, how much of the content have students covered? Does the evidence reflect that? Does the evidence cover only the content that they have covered? And if you've got evidence that covers content that you don't feel students have had sufficient time to cover, and going back to that idea about kind of securing their knowledge and having confidence in that content, ensuring that you signpost that, or indeed remove that from the evidence that you're using for students this year. It's also important to think about the authenticity of the evidence. So how can you be sure that the student's work was their own? Under what conditions was the work sat? And that's not to exclude work that was potentially done outside of the classroom, but to reflect on how useful that evidence is in supporting the grades that you're awarding to the student. As I say, what were the levels of control and supervision that you put in place around the assessment that you set for your students and at the time when that evidence was generated? Was it done under timed conditions? Were students given feedback about their evidence before they submitted a final version? Were they given access to additional resources to help them in completing that work? So all of those things need to be considered and factored into your decision when arriving at a final grade. And in terms of marking, it's important to consider how much support was available when applying the mark scheme. So I mentioned before about internal standardisation. What kind of mechanisms did you have in place to ensure that marking within the school was done consistently and fairly? Were teachers given all the tools they needed to make judgments in a consistent way with their peers? And as I mentioned before, there is no one type of evidence that would take precedence over another. And as I said, evidence gathered in conditions that enable confidence about the authenticity of the student's work would give you more confidence in the overall holistic judgment. That's not to exclude other forms of evidence, but we would ask that you consider the authenticity of the work and the conditions of the under which that work was completed when arriving at a holistic judgment of the grade for your students. So step 4, establish whether the proposed range of evidence is appropriate for all students. And as I mentioned before, we would ask that as far as possible, you take a consistent approach to using evidence within a cohort and within a particular subject. However, we absolutely understand that there will be exceptions. And as I mentioned before, individual students will have been impacted more or less over the course of the last 12 months. What's really important is that if you are using different evidence for your students, and if a particular student requires more or less evidence to be included in support of their grade, that you have a clear rationale why. So when you're collating that evidence, that you can clearly identify why an additional piece of evidence, or indeed why a piece of evidence is missing for a student, why that may be. It's also important to recognise that, of course, some students will have missed sections of teaching due to completely valid reasons, and this would include things like bereavements or potentially long-term illnesses. And of course, under normal circumstances, students would have available to them in examinations things like access arrangements. So it's really important that you think about what circumstances were students under at the point at which that evidence was completed. Were they given access to the types of arrangements that we would normally provide them when completing an assessment? If they weren't, what type of impact would that likely have had on their abilities during that assessment? And how will you make sure that they're given access to those arrangements when producing evidence in the future? It's really important that when you use evidence, you use the most appropriate evidence in terms of supporting the grade that you're awarding. So do disregard any evidence that would potentially disadvantage the student. So it's really important to think about, again, those circumstances under which it was produced and how far does that piece of evidence support the grade that you're awarding to students. And as I mentioned, you can absolutely use alternative evidence to replace any other assessments that you may be applying consistently across your cohort where individual circumstances of your students are applicable. So if they've missed an assessment, they weren't able to take part on the day, is there an alternative piece of evidence that they could produce to support the grade in a similar way to the rest of your students? So finally then, step 5 is for you to then assign a grade. So it's really important, as I said, that you consider the quality of the work in relation to the assessment materials. And in doing so, consider those alongside the grade descriptors and the grading exemplification that we have provided for every single subject and qualification. It's really important, again, just to stress, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, that you do not take into account potential or students' potential performance in a qualification. So, for example, if all the evidence collected for a student is of a grade 6 and 7, there would be absolutely no reason to consider providing that student any other grades. And that, again, it keeps stressing, key principle is the evidence, the grade you're awarding students this year must be supported by the evidence that you have to support that grade. There are some worked examples to help assist teachers in making those grading decisions, and those are again available on that JCQ website under the 2021 arrangements for this year. It's also important to note that as far as possible, grading decisions should not be made in isolation. So once those grades have been assigned, you should make sure that you've got an appropriate internal quality assurance process in place to help ensure that you are standardizing the award of grades across your department and across your centre, and ensuring that you're all using evidence in the same way and that you have taken similar factors into account when awarding grades to students this year. So as I say, there's a link here, and again, you'll be able to download this at the end of the session that takes you to some of those worked examples on the JCQ guidance. So I've mentioned before that to support you in your grading, that the awarding organisations have produced grade descriptors for GCSE, AS and A-level subjects. We've used the mid-grade performance to describe those that performance across those subjects and across those qualifications this year. So for A-level, we've provided grade descriptors for A, C and E, as well as additional characteristics of performance at the borderline of grades A and grade B. For AS level, we've used grade descriptors for grades A, C and E only. And for GCSE, grade descriptors have been created for grades 8, 6, 5, 4 and 2. As the basis for these, for GCSE in particular, the Ofqual had produced descriptors already for grades 8, 5 and 2, and we've used those as the starting point, but of course have added to those where we felt it was appropriate. And in addition to the grades that we outlined above, so the 8, 6, 5, 4 and 2, we've also produced borderline characteristics of performance at grades 4 and 3. I've mentioned it a few times, but all of the awarding organisations have created exemplification for each specification. So we have taken historical examination scripts from assessment sat before 2019 to illustrate the mid-grade performance of those grade descriptors. So we've taken the grade descriptors that are common to all awarding organisations and exemplified those using our own materials taken from historical examination performance by students. And they give you examples of how the types of standards that you will be using, the types of standards you will be applying to your students in order to make judgments for your grades this year. One of the one of the things that's been discussed a lot, and we've had lots of questions about, is the use of data this year. So there are two kind of really important things to remember about data and the use of data in arriving at grades for your students this year. The first and most important thing to remember is that historical grade performance by your students is a really useful tool to help you understand the grades that you're awarding to your students this year. What we would ask you to do is, once you have awarded grades to your students, and as a kind of reflective tool, before you submit your grades to the awarding organisations, that you consider the historical performance of students in subjects prior to 2020. And it's important to stress that the purpose of this is to look at how your grades align with that historical data, and to make sure that where they are higher or indeed lower or the same, that you have a rationale as to why. And it's really important that, as I mentioned before, the evidence that you have to support your grades, that evidence is in place and robust, and that it supports whatever grade it is you're looking to award your students. So it's a final kind of checkpoint just to make sure that you have a clear rationale and that you're aware of any differences in terms of your outcomes this year. What we would ask that you don't do is to use any kind of other sources of data that you might have, which may include tracking systems or target grades or predicted grades that you would use in a normal year to understand the types of trajectories that your students are on. As I say, one of the key principles this summer is to ensure that the grades awarded to students are rooted in the evidence that you have around their performance. So any type of data that you have about their potential or their progression in a subject would not be deemed appropriate in determining their grades this year. Okay. I'm aware we've been talking for about 35 minutes, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions. So, Connor, I think you have hopefully been keeping an eye out for questions as they've been coming in, and we'll do, as I say, our best to answer as many of those as we can in the next sort of 20 minutes or so.
Thanks, Mark. Afternoon all. So I've been keeping an eye on the Q&As as they've been coming through, and we've been getting a lot through, and I've been picking out some sort of common themes that have been coming. So one I'm going to put towards you, Mark, is remote and online exams. So is this sort of the theme? Is this an acceptable way to conduct exams, and how valid is that as a form of evidence in determining grades?
Sure, yeah, it's a really good question. It has come up a lot in sort of other sessions that we've done. I think the key with any assessment this year is being able to authenticate the student's work. And we obviously understand that during lockdown, and for many schools across the globe, indeed, they still haven't been able to return to the classroom. And of course, online assessment is one method of assessing students under those types of circumstances. Again, I think it comes back to thinking about authenticating that student work. So how confident are you in the circumstances under which it was produced? How confident are you that it is the student's own work? Did you have any arrangements in place, including things like remote proctoring, or any ability to ensure that students weren't being given any support or guidance during that assessment? But absolutely, online assessments, virtual assessments are all absolutely acceptable. But again, we would ask that you just reflect on the conditions under which it was sat and your level of confidence in the authenticity of the student's work.
Thanks for that, Mark. So another question we're going through is relating to international and unseen material. And some of the questions we've been getting in is around, can these be used on their own to determine a grade? Can they be used in conjunction with mock exams? How would you be able to shed some light on that?
Sure. So for those of you offering our international qualifications, we are making unseen materials available to schools. It is the case that you can just use those unseen materials in order to support your grades. They cover the full range of content we would typically cover in an examination series. And some centres, some schools and countries indeed around the world have already expressed that they will base their grades this summer purely on that evidence. What's important to recognise, though, is that we will also accept additional forms of evidence, including classwork or any other kind of mock assessment or past assessments that students may have completed. It's also the case that you can mix and match. So you could choose to use the unseen materials and then supplement that with additional assessment evidence if you so wish.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Mark. Another question that's been common is minimum use of evidence. I think we've got a lot of questions, and the questions are, what is the minimum amount of evidence that can be used? And as a sort of second part to that question that's been coming through is there guidance that it could be given to heads of centres to determine what is the minimum amount of evidence used in reaching a grade?
Sure. So I think there's two elements to this. So firstly, there is not a minimum level of evidence that we will expect centres to be able to gather for their students. As I mentioned before, we understand that for different students, for different countries, for different centres across the UK, they will have had very different experiences and impacts of the pandemic over the last 12 and 18 months. And so for that reason, it would be very difficult to have a minimum expectation. What is important to consider is when awarding your grades, that the evidence you have for those students match or align with the expected performance of students at those grades. And a really useful way of looking at that is to consider the grade descriptors and, of course, the grading exemplification that we have provided as well. But there is no minimum requirement in terms of evidence that needs to be produced.
Brilliant, thank you. And a few more questions are coming through around the definition of control and how do we define control, and is there a difference between medium and high control?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, again, in the JCQ guidance, there's additional information about what high, medium and low type of controls may look like. It's probably easier to consider the sort of difference between high controls and low controls. So high control would certainly be an exam type situation where students are sat in a classroom without any access to additional resources. They're not able to speak to each other and confer with their colleagues. And those assessments are sat potentially under timed conditions as well. At the bottom end, so for a kind of low level of control, it may be an assessment where students have had access to potentially useful teaching resources in order to help them complete the assessment. It may not have been timed, so they may have been able to complete that over a lesson or 2 lessons, or potentially in their own time. And there may have been less supervision around it as well. So again, students may have been able to confer with each other, or they may have been able to access information potentially on the website as well.
Brilliant, thanks. Another question we were getting through a couple of times was on authenticity, and I think so a few teachers are planning to get some candidates to sign a declaration that all work was their own. Is this an acceptable way? That makes sense?
Sure. So I think that's one sort of way that you could add additional confirmation to the authenticity of the work. I think it's really important, though, that as a teacher you consider how the level of confidence you have that the student's work is their own. I mentioned before that kind of example of a student kind of consistently gaining grade 6s on a piece of work, and how, therefore that would lead you to determine that the grade would be around about a grade 6. Clearly, if you've got some evidence that's been produced under lower controls that sits as an outlier from the grades that they've achieved under potentially higher controls, you may wish to reflect on the level of confidence that you have in those pieces of evidence.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Mark. And I think one or two questions around the external standardization from exam boards. Would you be able to explain this process in more detail?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So there are essentially 3 stages to the external quality assurance process this summer. The first of which starts with all of the awarding organisations reviewing the centre policies submitted by each individual centre. So I mentioned that the 30th of April is a sort of key deadline coming up very fast, where centres will have to submit their centre policy for this year, and that obviously sets out all of the processes you'll put in place around things like gathering evidence, standardising your teachers within the centre, making sure that you take account of any lost learning or evidence that the students may not have been able to produce, as well as your approach to grading students this year. And as I say, all of the awarding organisations will review your centre policies, and where needed, we may potentially contact you to have a further discussion. So stage 2, for centres who we do have concerns about in terms of their centre policy, and that could be for a number of reasons. It could just be that there are sections missing. It could be that they have not included key bits of information around some of the really fundamental parts of the process this year. We will put in place at stage 2 a virtual visit with your centre. It's really, really important to stress that these are collaborative meetings. They are there. We are here to support you. Those discussions are there to outline the concerns we have and help you put in place the procedures that you need to have confidence in the grades that you're awarding your students. So following stage 2, we then move into stage 3. So once all of the grades have been submitted by centres on the 18th of June, we will then conduct sampling of the evidence that's been used by centres to determine whether or not, firstly, the centre policy that they set out has been followed, and that the evidence that they have used supports the grades that they have awarded their students.
Thanks, Mark. So another question is, will we be receiving mark schemes for unseen materials?
Yes, we will be. So as with any kind of live series, what we will be producing is a mark scheme very soon after the assessment, so you can see the initial draft, and then a final version of that mark scheme will be made available, I think, 2 weeks after the sitting of the assessment, and that will obviously follow all of the standardisation meetings that we've had, as well as our review of the kind of initial responses that students have submitted to individual questions.
Brilliant, thank you. And probably thinking more about sort of GCSE maths, do higher and foundation count as different cohorts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. As I said before, we will be doing sort of more subject-focused lesson sessions in the coming weeks. There was a question I saw earlier actually about where do we find the details for those. So they're all on our training page on Edexcel's website. But in terms of the higher and foundation split, yes, we would consider a higher tier cohort to be different to a foundation tier cohort. And that just reflects the nature of the content that students study, the types of skills you would typically expect students being able to show, a foundation tier versus higher tier, and that may therefore necessitate slightly different forms of evidence to support their grades. They could, of course, be the same. As I said, there's not. It doesn't mean they have to be different, but it would be understandable that potentially some of that evidence would differ between foundation and higher.
Thank you. And another question, can we use non-Pearson material as high control evidence?
So yes, you can, absolutely. So the high level of control reflects the conditions under which that assessment was sat. I think, again, a kind of really key principle to remember, we highlighted it earlier, is that if you are using non-Pearson materials, that those materials reflect the qualification that you're awarding the grade to students for this year. So it's really important that the content is the same or can be mapped to our qualification, and the types of skills that are being assessed reflect the skills that students would be expected to show in Pearson's qualifications.
Thank you. And I've got a question as well. So if I can evidence that all of my students shade A, could that be awarded?
So kind of you dropped out just as you were saying the key part of that sentence. So could you repeat it for me?
Not a problem. So we've got a question in. So if I can show evidence that all of my students can be awarded a grade A, can that take place?
Yeah, so I think, again, the key principle here is that for you as a centre, you have to have confidence in the evidence that students have produced, and you need to be able to ensure that the evidence they have supports the grade that you have awarded. I won't comment specifically on individual centres who may award particular types of grades to their students, but the key principle is that the evidence that you have must support that grade, whatever that grade may be.
Brilliant, thank you. And do we have any further advice on practical assessments? So I think that's more thinking about GCSE science.
Sure. So again, I think in terms of kind of practical assessments, we recognise that for many centres it's not been possible to complete those. It may have been difficult to have access to the types of equipment or support that you need. Again, there's guidance on the JCQ website about the use of practicals, the approach to things like coursework, and how you can take account of any practicals or assessment that students haven't been able to complete due to the types of circumstances that they face this year. So do visit the JCQ website, and there's further guidance there on practical subjects as well as on coursework and NEA qualifications as well.
Thank you for that, Mark. So I'm just looking through some of the questions and just coming through a few common ones and trying to pick out ones that might be beneficial for everyone. So if we use past exam papers or unseen material and students have not covered all of the content, can we adjust grade boundaries accordingly?
Yeah, so I think the best way to think about sort of the use of past papers or the unseen material is once students have completed those assessments is to reflect upon the questions that they've been asked and the content and skills that you have taught them and the level of which you've been able to teach those particular areas. So it would be absolutely acceptable to discount a question, for instance, where you don't feel confident that your students would have had an opportunity to cover that particular piece of content. The alternative approach is that if you are devising your own assessments, and that could include using past papers and adapting them in some way, that you could absolutely remove any questions or any questions assessing skills or content that you don't feel confident your students have covered. Again, the key thing to remember is that you set that approach out in your centre policy, not again at subject level, but just to reference the fact that you will only assess or include evidence for students on areas of content and skills that they have covered. And when you are submitting your grades, that you have a clear rationale as to why particular questions or particular evidence may not exist because students were not able to cover that particular bit of content.
Thanks, Mark. And one or two questions just on NEA. So two questions. First one, can NEA grades be shared as they would in normal years with candidates? And how much weighting should I give to NEA? So normally it would be 20% for the year. Would 50% be allowable in this year?
Yeah, so I think I've seen a couple of comments say there's been kind of contradictory advice around NEA in the past. I think there is some clarification that we need to provide on this, and we'll do that as soon as we possibly can. I think in terms of the specifics of what proportion the NEA may play in the grades that you're awarding your students this year really depends upon the level of skills and content that NEA covers within the specification. So just as in a normal year, it's really important to think about what percentage of content or what content areas have students been able to cover. If they've been able to do that through NEA, then that evidence is absolutely acceptable. But of course, NEA will usually tend to focus on particular content areas and particular skills. So again, if it's worth 20%, it may be that there are other assessments that you may need to include in order to support the grades for your students. If it's worth 80%, then obviously you would perhaps put greater weighting on the NEA that they have completed.
Thank you for that, Mark. So we've talked about the minimum number of evidence that we can potentially have, but we do have a question. Is there a maximum number of evidence that schools can provide?
No, there is no maximum. Again, I think the sort of balance to strike is, and it's one of the key principles that was put out when the approach to this summer was set out through the Ofqual consultation, is that, of course, what we want to ensure that students have an opportunity to continue their learning for as long as possible. So it's important to balance that against the requirements of pulling together evidence to support grades for your students this year. As long as the evidence matches to the grade descriptors and the grading exemplification and supports the grades that you're awarding, that is the requirement, but there's no minimum and there's no maximum, as said before.
Brilliant. And just seen two questions on this. So how do we get hold of additional assessment materials? It's been mentioned a lot. How do I access this?
Sure. So I've mentioned before our specific subject support for 2021, the links for which are contained in this presentation. So you'll be able to download that towards the end. In there, you'll be able to follow through to subject pages for individual qualifications. And in there, you'll be able to download the additional assessment materials that we've produced for each subject. It's important to remember that those materials are under padlock. So you will need an Edexcel online account in order to access those. It's probably worth mentioning at this point, because there's been questions about this in the past. We have also been required to make publicly available those additional assessment materials. What I would say at this point is that those are just the questions. They do not include the mark schemes or any of the examiner report support or exemplification that we've provided to teachers. So if you go onto the subject support page, you'll be able to download the additional assessment materials, including questions and mark schemes. But those questions included in those materials have been made publicly available as well.
Thanks. I do know we are coming up to 5 o'clock, so we still have questions coming in, but I'm picking out sort of the most common ones. We've had one or two on entry-level qualifications. So is there any advice? Is that following the same process as we are with our general qualifications, which being sort of teacher-led, teacher-assessed?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, they are following the same approach, and we'll be providing additional guidance around entry level very shortly.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question is, so to what extent will you be looking at the work rather than the marks?
Sure. So I think the question obviously refers to stage 3. So I think probably worth noting that there was a announcement by Ofqual setting out some of the further detail about how the external quality assurance process will work this summer. In terms of what we will review evidence. So that would include not just the marks or the grades that are awarded to the pieces of work, but also the actual physical evidence that students have produced as well. But again, further details on exactly how that process will work have been published by Ofqual, and I think is available on their website now.
Thanks, Mark. So another question, would using historical grade boundaries be a good indication of grades?
That's a really good question. So, of course, if you're using our past assessment materials, we do have grade boundaries available for those. I think it's worth mentioning that, of course, with grade boundaries, they can fluctuate. They can go up and down between series, and they reflect the strength of the cohort at the time at which that assessment was sat. It's a reasonable starting position to use those grade boundaries in setting grades for students, but we would ask that you reflect on those against the grade descriptors and also the grading exemplification that we provided as well. So yes, as part of the evidence you're using, you can look at the grade boundaries, but of course please do reflect on the grade descriptors as well.
Thanks, Mark. So will there be mark schemes for additional assessment materials made publicly available?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So no, we are not intending to publish the mark schemes for the additional assessment materials. So what we have been required to do is to publish the questions that forms the basis of those additional assessment materials, but that does not include the mark schemes and any other additional guidance or support that we've provided in relationship to them. So we have provided examiner reports, we provided exemplification, marking exemplification, and responses to questions by students on past paper questions as well, none of which will be available publicly. They are all available under padlock on our website.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Mark. I think we've just hit 5 o'clock, and I'm conscious it is a Friday, and I don't keep anyone longer than what they have. I'm not sure if there are any lasting notes you want to mention, Mark, or?
I don't think so. I see there's a number of questions about NEA. I think we will take away an action just to revisit all of the support and guidance that's been put around NEA. If there's further guidance we could provide, we will of course do that as quickly as we possibly can. I think, as mentioned, just a couple of things to really remember. Firstly is that centre policy deadline on the 30th of April. Please do visit the JCQ website. It has all of the guidance and support that you will need this year. And in terms of that subject-specific support, please do visit our website to look at individual subjects and qualifications and the range of support that we've put in place to support you.
Amazing, thank you for that, Mark, and thank you to everyone for attending today. That is the end of the session. If you do need any further support or help or guidance, please do feel free to visit our Pearson Professional Development Academy and the Pearson website, as well as our subjects qualification pages where we have our additional assessment information. That's it from me.
Thanks, Connor. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.